welcome to Teachers Talk Radio. This is the Friday Lunch Show with Whitfield and Todd Brennan. Today is Friday, the 14th of February, 2025, and today we're going to be discussing attachment theory in education with our special guest, Saskia Dodds-Smith. Tune in, text in, and enjoy the show. Well, happy Friday and happy Valentine's Day, everyone. Todd, how are you doing?
All good, all good. Can you hear me okay?
I can. I hope that you're having a lovely Friday afternoon. So today we have actually a really special show. We're going to be looking at attachment theory in education, and we have a special guest with us, Saskia Dodds-Smith. Saskia, how are you doing?
I'm doing great. Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, we're so lucky to have you. I'm actually really excited because Saskia works at my school, and she delivered an inset on attachment theory that actually was incredibly eye-opening. Staff came out of there kind of shaking their heads, saying that they had found this missing piece, that they felt that they had found children. All of a sudden they realized were connected to them, and they saw those connections kind of more deeply and in a more enlightened way than ever before. So I think that attachment theory is something that I honestly don't know that much about, and I feel like I have so much to learn.
Agreed, yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Todd.
No, I was just thinking then, as obviously we're both secondary trained, and it's something that my wife would talk about in a primary context, but it's something that, yeah, without her shared knowledge, I really wouldn't feel that I knew very much about it all. And I think that's probably the same for a lot of secondary staff, right? Or am I unique there?
Yeah, I really feel like I was a little bit out of my depth with attachment theory. So I think maybe that's true. It would be something that comes up in a more primary context, but it resonates really deeply, I think, just as much in secondary. So why don't we do a brief introduction of Saskia, because she is one of the most erudite and kind of wise people I've ever met. She was born and she grew up in the UK, and she studied psychology at the University of Michigan. And on her return to London, she worked for social services as a targeted key worker. And this involves supporting young people to navigate a range of difficulties, such as being in the care system, those at risk of sexual exploitation, and school refusal. Her first ideas around attachment were really formed when she embarked on her training as a psychodynamic psychotherapist. And since qualifying, she's worked at a number of schools in London, and she now oversees the counseling team at the British International School in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. So Saskia, you have an incredible amount of training and depth of knowledge. So we can't wait to have you share with us. Can I ask you to just give a very, very simple introduction? What is attachment theory?
You'll probably find as we go on that sometimes summarizing it in a simple way is quite difficult. But essentially, it's looking at how our really early attachment experiences, so the quality of our really early attachments, and we're talking early infancy, so sort of from birth upwards, how they impact and shape the way in which we relate to people throughout our lives, and patterns of behavior and emotional regulation, how we learn, which is obviously something that hopefully we'll talk a lot about today. But it's looking at the connection between those early experiences and sort of how we go on to operate through our lives.
That actually makes a lot of sense. My first port of call when I think about attachment theory is attachment parenting, which I always thought of when I had my own children. It's a style of parenting that really is something for a baby to toddlerhood. I didn't think about how that would echo throughout a child's life and how it might have ramifications later on. And I think that's what I'm kind of interested in digging in today. So how did attachment theory really develop, and what are its core concepts that we might be familiar with?
So I think it's impossible to talk about attachment theory without talking about John Bowlby. He's sort of seen as the father of attachment theory. And essentially, he was working kind of around the 50s, 60s, then into the 70s. And he was particularly interested in, I guess, understanding sort of infants and what leads to good development, what kind of early experiences contribute to an infant being able to be successful in essentially how they operate. And one of the things that he sort of came up against around that time was the behaviourist approach, which was essentially that if we feed infants, we make sure that they're comfortable and warm enough, etc., then their needs are met. And what seems probably obvious to us now, but maybe at the time wasn't so obvious, was that actually we know that infants' needs in that sense can be met. An infant can be fed, but yet they still cry. And ultimately what he came to discover and understand more about was an infant's innate need for attachment to a caregiver, that kind of proximity seeking that is obviously a crucial part of very early development. So he kind of first came across these ideas, and interestingly, at the time, again, it seems obvious to us, but at the time, was the kind of alien concepts. And he came to actually work alongside the World Health Organization because they began recognizing his work and realizing that actually they needed to rethink some of their policies around and guidance around, for example, kind of visitation rights in hospitals for children. Up until that point, children, could be in hospital for months and have very little visitation kind of opportunities with caregivers, and that was changed in response to lots of his findings. So he's a key player, but actually, in order to sort of understand the key concepts, there is some stuff worth us kind of talking through, because as well as John Bowlby, there was a Canadian child psychologist called Mary Ainsworth, and she was equally interested in this idea of children's development and what constitutes essentially kind of good early experiences, good parenting. And she came to collaborate with Bowlby. And she was looking at the idea of a kind of safe base, and it's something that we'll probably come back to in our conversations, because actually it relates to a huge amount of kind of all the different areas of development around emotional regulation, kind of capacity to learn, independence. But she created, or she developed a quite famous study or test called the strange situation test, which obviously this is a lot kind of upfront in response to your question, but it's
No,
really
I'm really
useful.
fascinated by this because I have heard of the strange situation test. So please continue.
No, it's great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, brilliant. So it's essentially I'll describe the test. It was at that point, because really the primary caregiver was usually the mother. Of course, since then it's been replicated with fathers and with all different caregivers. But at this point, it was the mother and their infant. And the infant at this point was around sort of 12 to 18 months old. So just able to sort of move around and crawl and play sort of independently to an extent. And the study first began with the mother and infant in a playroom, and it was essentially kind of an appealing playroom that was desirable for the child, and it had toys in. And the study went through kind of sequences of events that would take place within this period of time. And the first event was that the mother would be in there and the infant was able to have a few minutes to kind of explore and play. They would then have a stranger that would come into the room and sit, and then later try to interact and play with the infant. Then following that, the mother would leave the room, and the child would usually become kind of distressed and aware of this. A few minutes later, the mother would return. And throughout this whole process, they were observing two key things, essentially. One was that infant's capacity to explore the room. So what did that exploration look like? Were they able to crawl off and play with things? How often did they kind of check for their parent? What did that look like? And then the second thing was the capacity to be soothed by the parent on their return. So obviously, often the infant would become distressed when that parent returned. Kind of what did that sort of reuniting experience look like? And the reason that it's really useful to understand this study is that so much of what we end up talking about when we talk about attachment theory, and actually when we relate it to education, are these two things, one being the capacity to explore. This isn't just a physical capacity, it's an emotional capacity, and we'll probably talk more about that. And then this idea of emotional regulation. So what they found when they carried this study out with lots and lots of different mothers and their infants was that the infants tended to fall into three categories. So the first category was secure attachment. And secure attachment would look like the infant being able to explore, being able to play. They would check for the carer, for the parent being there, but they felt safe and sort of comfortable enough to explore their environment. They would become distressed when the parent left because, of course, that's their attachment figure and proximity to them is stability. But then when they returned, when the parent returned, they were able to be soothed quite quickly and go back to exploring. Then they had avoidant children. So avoidant children would not be particularly interested in the caregiver when they were exploring. There wasn't an obvious attachment or seeking of proximity to that caregiver. Equally, when the stranger came in, they might not have been thrown off by them in the same way. When the parent left the room, they might not, I would say, care is the wrong way of putting it, but they didn't display distress in the same way. So there was a strange sort of avoidance of that connection. And then there was sort of anxious. And actually what's interesting is sometimes when you look at these categories, they get called slightly different things, but these are kind of, broadly speaking, the categories. You then had anxious children. So children who were anxiously attached they tended to be unable to explore and to play even when the caregiver was there. So they often get called preoccupied anxious, which means that they are essentially preoccupied with the attachment relationship. They don't feel settled, even with the parent there, enough to be able to explore. Equally, when the parent left, they'd become distressed, but on their return, the parent wasn't really able to soothe them. They were never quite able to kind of bring that distress down. And then finally, and this was a category that was actually added later on by another kind of researcher, but there is now a category called disorganized attachment. And these are a very small minority, but they tend to be your children who've experienced serious trauma and maybe have had very chaotic environments that they've grown up in or very inconsistent parenting. And they tend to be fearful of the caregiver, but that doesn't mean they don't seek proximity, but they tend to behave in what might be considered more erratic ways. When the parent leaves the room, they kind of bang their head on the floor or things that would feel very extreme. So they are, fortunately, a kind of minority. But interestingly, securely attached children tend to make up, the statistics vary slightly when you look at them, but they tend to make up about 65% of all children. And that is across cultures, which is, I think, fascinating when we take into consideration, different styles of parenting, collectivist versus individualist societies. It tends to be very consistent. So essentially, to try and summarize, attachment theory is about looking at initially those key things, which is what does that really early attachment look like? How is it built? And how does it impact an infant's capacity for independence, for emotional independence, and kind of emotional regulation, and their capacity to explore and feel safe to do that?
Saskia, it's a great guess when you, as part of the show, you have like 4 questions off their opening kind of spiel. And I genuinely don't know which one to drive towards. But the 2 things that are jumping out at me immediately is the last group that you spoke about. Is that the kind of the student that wants to make chaos because that feels comfortable? And I know that's very, very big as a question. And then second of all, how does this sort of tie in? I assume from the way you're speaking, you know about Harlow's. I don't know what else to call it other than wire monkey mother. I don't know what the
Yes.
proper term. Like
Yeah.
Yeah, the
it
wire
sort of
monkey mother. That's what I
suggests.
always think of too with attachment. That's
Yeah.
exactly
Like,
it.
how does that tie in with that idea of the sort of the necessity of attachment? And the wire monkey is Harlow, right? Not Marlowe.
Harlow, yeah, and actually
Thank
that's
you.
it's a study that comes up when you look at attachment theory, and it's obviously understandably really criticised these days for sort of how immoral it is. But yes,
And
absolutely. So
What?
unethical, yes.
Well, that's fine,
yeah,
isn't it? Let's
exactly,
electrocute
unethical.
some monkeys. What's the problem?
Yeah,
Yeah, really troubling. But equally, I think when we look at this kind of topic, it's pretty fascinating because it sounds like there's a necessity for attachment, and yet it sounds like there are children and analogously, I guess, monkeys that would think attachment isn't for me. This isn't going to work as a strategy. Is that?
yeah,
Sorry, I'll
yeah,
let
and
you speak
actually,
because you know a lot.
oh,
Oh, I think so. Saskia, it's really interesting. When we look at the monkey study, which
yeah,
sounds so funny to say, perhaps you could explain that because at the very beginning, when you were going into attachment, you kind of described something that would have, I thought, have been intuitive. That if you leave children alone too long in the hospital, they're not going to do well because they need that human connection and contact with someone
yeah.
like their mothers. So the monkey experiment kind of demonstrated that. Do you want to share just really simply what that is? Because I think that's one of the things that people read about attachment that immediately kind of sticks with them.
Yeah, so this was, and I may sort of get bits of this wrong, but the general gist of this study was that they had a monkey, they had monkeys that had been taken away from their parents sort of virtually at birth, and they were put into a space where they had a monkey that was a sort of parent monkey that was made out of wire, but that provided food, provided milk. So they had this monkey, and then they also had a monkey that was kind of made of cloth that was considered soft and comfortable. And they predicted that the monkeys would essentially just need nourishment. So they would go to the wire monkey and be fed, and that's all that they would need. But what they found was that the monkey would go to that wire monkey for food, and then they would go back to this cloth monkey kind of for comfort, and that was where they would spend their time. So so again, like you say, it just demonstrates this innate need for attachment. And actually, Todd, something that you said there's really, it's really important. And actually, I want to come back to that, this idea that when we look at the strange situation test, there are some children that I've described that it sounds like they have given up on attachment, basically. They don't seek attachments, and maybe these resistant or avoidant children.
Yeah.
But actually, what's happened is they need attachment just as much as anyone, and actually probably you could argue more. But
Mm-hmm.
what's happened is they haven't had an experience of their needs being met. So they know that behaving, that essentially asking for something is not responded to.
Yeah,
So
like the social contract is unreliable, so
yeah,
therefore I need it more, but I trust it less. Is that
absolutely,
right?
exactly. That's exactly it. And after a while, they are essentially programmed to know that it doesn't work when I do this, and so they stop trying. But actually, those infants would, that will be really problematic for them later in life, and they will still have an innate need and drive to connect, but we might just have to work quite a lot harder to connect with those individuals. But yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
when you were speaking, it
It's really
reminded me
interesting,
of
Saskia.
a student that I taught many moons ago who was diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder. And
Yeah.
it was very much that real need. I need you to believe in me. I need you to, want to work with me. But in actual fact, equally, I don't want to show you any signs that I want that.
Yeah.
And you were very much reminding me of that there where you were speaking.
Yeah, and actually that, you could also look at those children as being kind of anxious in their attachment as well. And I think this is where sometimes I try not to get hung up too much on categorizing, because I think really we kind of can fall into different categories in certain ways. But those people, and you mentioned before, maybe children that are quite disruptive, or they keep themselves at the center of attention all the time. They might have had really inconsistent responses to their needs. So the only way that they feel that they can elicit that response is to sort of be very intense all the time. And that comes from an insecure attachment. And that's, quite common in the classroom, that you might have a child that, invades your personal space, constantly kind of shouts out, can't really contain themselves, maybe really struggles with focus. And that, that makes us wonder what that early parenting might have looked like. For example, one day maybe the mother's really responsive and gives them what they need and spends lots of time, and then the next day they might be really preoccupied with something else and dismissive. So there's no kind of stability, internal security that's been internalized by that person, by that child. Yeah.
I think it's really fascinating. You said that about 65% of children across different cultures would be kind of categorized as secure. And I know that it's really, really hard to kind of give these kind of 4 clear labels and expect students to be kind of pigeonholed or neatly stacked into one of them. But I found it really interesting. Avoidant and anxious, I feel like almost immediately students spring to mind that are avoidant. Like they don't seem too interested in being validated or like asking permission. Like they seem like a little less emotional, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And then when I think about anxiety, is so that idea of like being anxious, like constantly kind of hiding behind the caregiver, being very much unable to explore by themselves, being very difficult to soothe. I can think of those types of students kind of right away. And I'm wondering, I've seen those students kind of grow out of those stages as well and become more confident or less avoidant. How do these change over time? And does it require interventions, or do students tend to self-soothe or self-regulate? Do they need tools, or do they find tools, I guess?
So it's a really good question. I think that what we see is that whereas in kind of very early life, a caregiver and maybe those individuals in the home are the people that infants or young children will spend the majority of their time with. So if they, as adults, are not able to provide a consistent sort of pattern of care, then it's very hard in those moments for them to develop those skills. But what we see, and I guess this is where, educators play such a huge role in kind of shaping children's behavior, is actually if they then later in life interact enough with caregivers that are consistent, are safe, containing, reliable, they're able to trust them, then over time, it's kind of just like little ingredients going in, and eventually they can develop some of those skills. And, things like peer relationships are absolutely huge particularly with adolescents in shaping some of that. So yes, I think that one of the things I find sort of reassuring when you listen to this research first and see how robust it can be across an individual's life, you can sometimes feel slightly demoralized and think that there's no hope for change. But actually, when we look now and understand more about things like neuroplasticity, and actually the way that schools have learned they're not just an environment to educate, with content, they're about social and emotional learning equally, if not even more so. I think that's what gives children the capacity to access that environment and make use of it. The difficulty comes when maybe someone's attachment is so chaotic that they can't make use of those relationships.
Yeah.
There's
It's sort of
there about...
no, sorry.
Go ahead, Todd.
No, it's just sort of making
we
me
always
think.
do this.
No, well, because it's an interesting topic, and like 100 things are running through my head, as I'm sure they are yours and every listener to the show. But is there any evidence? Obviously, you're saying that it's cross culture. Is there any evidence that it's kind of something that's socialized? Is it something that's innate? Or some young people more inclined to find attachment where perhaps there isn't? So they could find secure attachment in quite insecure environments. Does that sort of make sense?
Yeah. So I guess one thing to say, which I think is interesting, is that there's actually less diversity in kind of prevalence of these categories when it comes to sort of looking across cultures. There's actually more diversity within cultures when it comes to kind of socioeconomic background. So I think one of the things that we know about attachment is that it's heavily influenced by the parents' sort of state of mind. So if you are in a healthy home as a parent, you're able to provide that care more readily. If you are in a home where there's high stress, financial difficulties, domestic violence, any stresses, it means the parent is then less able to provide that, or maybe at least to provide it consistently. So I think that's where we see these differences with socioeconomic kind of backgrounds. But in terms of, I think as with anything, there's a nature nurture kind of combination. And I do think that there will undoubtedly be children that have more of a social, drive, ability. Maybe some have a temperament that makes them more able to connect with others. And then there may be children that really sort of have a predisposition that makes their nature, their temperament is even with the right environment, is much more challenging. So I don't doubt for a second. I think that what's clear is that when we average out all of these statistics, they do tend to be pretty robust, which I guess says something about how early these experiences are. They're pre-verbal, they're regardless of background, a parent can give that really good quality early interaction. And actually, it's probably worth me saying something about what it looks like to build secure attachment. Like, what does secure attachment really, where does it really come from? How is it built? So I don't know if we've got time for me to quickly.
We absolutely
Definitely. Why don't
do.
you give us an idea of secure attachment, and then we'll go into the ads. But I think this would be really worthwhile, because I think it provides a really great foundation for understanding some of our other questions.
Yeah. So really, with a very young infant, if anybody has interacted with tiny babies, they're kind of just they're like little wiggly worms. They don't really feel emotions, but they feel physical sensations. So that might be a digestion, it might be they're hot, cold, hungry, and in those very early stages, they don't understand their internal world, essentially. So parents will often talk about babies when they cry, when they're newborns, the way they cry, it's like their life is at risk. It's just everything, whether they're hungry, cold, everything feels kind of life-threatening. And then over time, that cry kind of differentiates, and parents will say, oh, I know, when to be worried and when not to, and things like that. So actually, there was a psychoanalyst or a pediatrician called Winnicott, and he is, he's talked about a lot when you study as a therapist, but he talked about something called mirroring, which is a really key part of early attachment. So that's the idea that you as the caregiver mirror back the infant's feelings. And over time, they begin to understand their internal world. So if that infant is distressed, you might find yourself talking to them in a way that, you're frowning and you're saying, oh dear, we're not having a good day, or you kind of mirror back that feeling. Equally, if they're happy and content and kind of exploring things, then you might be cheerful and smiling, and you're feeding that back. And over time, if we do that repeatedly, and essentially we have to be kind of in tune with the infant, then they internalize an understanding about themselves. It's almost like they see themselves mirrored back. So they begin to understand how they feel in different moments. One of the things that can be really difficult is if the parent, there can be things that interfere with this. Essentially, the parent might, for example, be suffering with postnatal depression. They're unlikely to be able, they're often associated with maybe a blank face. So the infant is displaying lots of different emotions or feelings, and what they're seeing mirrored back to them doesn't display that nuance, that variety. So they can't make sense of their internal world. Really, Winnicott talked all about the kind of good enough mother, which is, I think, a nice way of thinking about it, because sometimes when we hear these things, we think, oh gosh, what if I get it wrong? What if I'm mirroring back the wrong thing? What if I'm not in tune? But actually, it's about being in tune enough that they consistently, over time, internalize a better understanding about about themselves. So some of those children that we've probably touched on already that seem sort of unemotional, as you said, Morgan, some of that is because they actually don't understand their own internal world. They can't make sense of it. They haven't had those very early experiences to help them make sense of it. So it's a bit of a mystery to them. And I guess that's where we as educators, we as just adults in their lives, can help with that.
And
That's really
it's really hard
yeah.
to let you finish a sentence without asking a question because, like, for instance, there's someone that's kind of reached some sort of Buddhist level of enlightenment, and sees that all things are only, meaningful if we give them meaning. Equally, might reflect that same sort of response to their child, and yet, as you've said there, that might to the child seem like a non-recognition. Um, so that good enough model, actually, I really appreciate that. I think that's probably good for educators as well, because how on earth could someone adequately reflect and model appropriate response to a child in with all the emotions that, particularly a young child, but equally teenagers, that they go through? It seems incredibly fraught just from a conceptual point of view.
Yeah, absolutely. And I often, I'm so aware that I'm not a teacher. I'm dealing mostly with children in one-on-one in kind of situations. But teachers will talk to me and say, how on earth do I achieve these things when I'm managing 20 plus children in one space? But I think actually really what attachment, I guess, gives us hope about is those small interactions, even within maybe a chaotic environment at times, whether it's in small moments of one-to-one conversation in the corridors. These small interactions and conversations can have a really big impact. So it kind of gives us hope, and we don't have to get it right or even be able to do it all the time.
I think this is fantastic because I think there's understanding the theory, which is kind of the foundation that we as educators need to have. But then it's the next steps. What do we do with that theory that could be impactful and meaningful? Why don't we take a little pause and then we can come back and ask a few more questions and just elaborate on those. Thank you so much, Saskia.
No problem.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalized timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
And we are back. So we were just talking about attachment theory, and we began to explore what that might look like if we applied it in classrooms. And I think that can seem quite daunting because when you were describing a student or a child rather, who might be avoidant because their inner world right from the get-go seems kind of fraught and perhaps broken because they weren't given the tools to express those feelings. It seems kind of scary to think that we might have that child in our class and we might not be able to give them all the help that they need to thrive. What would be the very first steps that a teacher could take? Are there things that we should kind of see in students and then perhaps kind of help them emotionally, socially, emotionally first before we even touch teaching and learning? Or are they kind of something that's entwined together?
I mean, I'm really glad you asked that because actually one of the things that I always come back to is the idea that really learning can't take place, or at least it can't take place to the greatest capacity without the child feeling that environment is a safe environment. So actually creating the right environment is always going to be more important than the content that they might be learning. And I know that's a very difficult thing to say to a teacher who has a lot of content that they've got to kind of teach a student. But um, but but absolutely, without feeling safe to explore, without feeling that they can manage their emotions and regulate, it's going to be almost impossible. It's I kind of imagine it's a bit like putting someone in a room with a lion and then asking them to learn their times tables. They're preoccupied with feeling unsettled and anxious. It's and I think it's something that's so unconscious. It's very difficult for us to relate to. But I think that's where it's so much about the environment that we create in the classroom and having a sort of consistent set of essentially values, rules. In lots of cases when it comes to insecurely attached children, routine is huge. So things that are predictable, how do we make this a consistent, reliable, predictable, and as much as possible kind of calm place, which I know again is easier sort of said than done. But that doesn't mean to say they don't overlap. I think there's so much research to show that outcomes for children are impacted hugely by their relationships with teachers. And I speak all the time to students who will say things to me like, "Oh, I hated biology last year, but I love my teacher this year, and it's one of my favorite subjects." Suddenly they're thriving in that subject, and that's about the relationship they have with that teacher. And I think even as adults we remember those positive relationships we had with teachers when we were younger.
Yeah. I think there's something about rapport. Like, I think as soon as you're in teacher training, you're told about the importance of building rapport. When I think about attachment theory and I think about these different types of students, one of the things that immediately comes to mind is some of these students are hard to build rapport with. And then some of them, when you do build rapport with them, become really reliant on you. They're always coming up to you at break. They come up to you when you're working at your desk in class and constantly want reassurance and ask questions sometimes. Some of them, they're really, really hard to connect with. And you feel like, I've been teaching this kid for 2 years and I still haven't built a real relationship where they're looking me in the eye. And I feel like they have a little bit of give and take,
Do you feel, Morgan, sorry to interrupt, but do you feel like that's an individual teach thing? I feel like that's a community thing, because like a kid that attaches to me might not attach to you, but as long as across a community they've got enough avenues to try and make connections, I think we get too caught up on relationships on an individual basis. We're one community. You're not, I don't know, it's not a fully thought out thought just at this moment, but it feels like we get really caught up on the individual, and yet we're supposed to be a community. And so many kids might, I get on really well with Mr. Brennan, he gets me, but Miss Whitfield, she's nice, but she's not really sure about me. Do you know what I mean? Does that make sense?
I mean, for me, that definitely, yeah. I was sorry, Morgan. I was just going to say, I think it's a really good point, because one of the things as well that happens with attachment is sometimes you might not see the kind of outcomes of your hard work in the space of time you spend with that student. But when we get to kind of track students through their time, we notice that positive development. And what the reason that some children will attach with certain staff members and not others may also be to do with that teacher's attachment style. So I think there's so much that we kind of bring. It's a two-way relationship. There's things that we bring. I speak constantly to teachers who will say, "Oh, I find this student really, really difficult," but then, their drama teacher says they have no problem with them at all. Does that mean that I'm doing something wrong? I think we bring ourselves to these, to all of these classes, and in some moments we'll be able to connect because there's something about our attachment styles that feel compatible. Maybe in other moments, not so. But I do also think, Morgan, what you're saying about being unable to connect is always a really interesting idea, because that says something about that young person's early experiences. And again, they may have had no experience of their needs being met, or at least very little experience of their needs being met. So they actually don't know how to elicit a response in an adult. So it can take a really long time for them to develop that ability and to have it reinforced enough that they can make use of it.
So is it something, Saskia, like rarely attaches adequately, rather than, only attaches with X, Y, and Z people? it's rarely attaches with anyone is when we start to worry. Or
Yes, and I think that this is probably a criticism of attachment theory, is that we can get really hung up on, you are securely attached or you are insecurely attached. And I think that's probably an unrealistic way of putting it. I think we'd probably say that we might be, majority securely attached, but we all have our moments or our situations that we struggle with. But yes, and I think that if you have somebody who's so insecurely attached and really doesn't know how to relate to others and make those connections, they are the individuals that we see sort of really struggling in all areas of school. Maybe school refusers, or behavior is so bad that they kind of can't make use of that time anyway. Those are the individuals that are most challenging.
It's really interesting when you hear those types described and you look at like avoidant, anxious, disorganized, or chaotic. Some of the things that you were describing, they sounded like traits that I would associate with ADD or ADHD, or those students who are neurodiverse. Is there overlap there, or can we miss attachment theory if a student has other key identifiers? How does that kind of work if there's some type of intersectionality?
Yeah, so this is something that comes up often, and I think we can. What I notice is that we can maybe become obsessed with whether it is, let's say, ADHD or whether it is attachment. And people will say to me, what if we think it's attachment but really it's ADHD or ASD or other things that might look similar in some ways? What I always think about that is that we won't necessarily know. I mean, unless we can see brain scans that make it very clear, which I think is almost impossible. Most of the
Yeah.
time it's a sort of trial and error process. And what I would say is that a lot of the same strategies that you might use, for example, with a young person with ADHD, would probably look quite similar to how you might respond to the equivalent attachment need. So, for example, structure, helping them understand their emotions, helping them focus, making things predictable. All of these things actually fit really nicely with attachment, because you're essentially repairing and reintroducing some of those things that might have been missing in their early lives. And I think we'd struggle to sort of do damage by attempting those things. I think the strategies are similar enough that we may never know exactly where it comes from, but I do think it's really important to know that that they can look really similar, actually. And what I notice is that from previously working in social services, some of the children that I work with who had come from really chaotic home environments, maybe very volatile or unpredictable, they were often later diagnosed with ADHD. And who knows kind of exactly what it was, but it looked like that and it manifests in that way.
Mhm.
So as long as the thinking is around how to support and what strategies help, I think that's the most important thing. It doesn't matter too much. Although the only thing I would say on that is that when we think of attachment, we're much more likely to be interested in working with parents in understanding how they're impacting their child. So I think it's just really important to look at the whole kind of family and dynamics holistically to be able to respond to that.
There's a lot to unpack there. I think it's fascinating. Todd's point about the idea of, well, we have a community, and that community and those shared values and respect is something that can be really key in giving a child or a student emotional tools. And that might be a very, very long journey that's not from an individual teacher. That makes sense to me. The idea that it's a two-way street, like you have your own baggage that you bring into the rapport, and how you run a classroom. It's really interesting to me to think that the routines and the structures, it doesn't matter what how we look at these different types, or whether it's something that has to do with a diagnosis of ADHD or attachment theory. But routines and structures are going to be helpful strategies no matter what. When we take a look at parents, though, as soon as you bring parents into the equation, there's kind of like this huge limitation or possibility. How do we bring parents into the fold to be a part of that journey if we notice that a student is having difficulties?
Yeah, I mean, I work a lot with parents, and we do, we'll have lots of one-to-one conversations with parents when a specific student's struggling, and equally we do kind of workshops. And I think if we think kind of on a bigger scale, I would say that sort of a psychoeducation approach with parents can be really useful. It's quite a confronting topic, because essentially you're saying your behavior has potentially led to your child struggling. And actually, that's always the case with parenting. I feel like the whole point is that you feel your way through it. Yeah. But I think when we speak in a group setting, and we educate on what attachment looks like, on what, if your child is feeling anxious in this way, these are the ways that you might be able to respond to them. It makes it less personal. And what we find is that parents are actually really curious. Parents really want to know how to respond. They want to understand, and they feel really relieved and kind of validated when their difficulties are heard and somebody gives them strategies. I always find it interesting whenever I do talks on attachment, people in the audience always say to me, I spent my whole time thinking about my own children. I spent my whole time thinking about my relationships, my friends, my parents. We have to think about ourselves in it. And like you say, kind of what we bring. So I think when we do a psychoeducation sort of approach with parents, actually there's a real buy-in for that. So that, yeah, I mean, obviously working one-to-one with specific cases is also really important, but more broadly in schools, I think that's an approach we can take that works really well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And I think I would almost think I would be scared of making a parent defensive sometimes, but I think it's really interesting that they see all of the benefits and they would want to be involved and curious, because that's immediately my thought. I'm immediately going to my own children and thinking about how they react to when I leave the room, or how secure they would be and exploring a space. Like, I immediately think of my own children, and I'm curious, as opposed to furious, which I think is another way that a parent could react.
Yeah.
Todd, what do you have next for us? Because I know you've been dying to ask a few questions.
No, I think we all are, aren't we? And I'm sure listening to this is very much the same experience, because like you just hinted at there, Morgan, we also have experiences as parents. And, I'm certainly thinking about my own children. You inevitably think about your own childhood. You think about students that you've had big wins with, and students you've had, maybe not so much success with. So it's definitely a really fascinating topic. And we've sort of touched on a little bit there what I was going to ask, which was about sort of cultural relativism, because, to some communities, I'm thinking in the Southeast, there was a lot of traveller students came through, and their expectations for parents was that they had to serve their parents. Parents would come and go. They weren't expecting parents to be around all the time. And they were kind of actually very loving and very sort of caring about their parents. And yet a lot of their behaviours in the classroom, obviously were culturally jarring for other students. So I wondered about that cultural relativity. But we sort of touched on this with the idea that schools should be a community, and that sort of, I almost butted in again and wanted to ask a question about recruitment, actually, and diversity of recruitment, because I think, a homogeneous, I can never say this word.
Homogeneous.
Thank you. Well, homogeneity in recruitment. Is that right? Correct me, please. Is actually, there's a danger there as well in terms of our student well-being, which obviously is at the forefront of everyone's mind in general, but especially at the moment, I feel. So I must admit, I've got about 10 different avenues open here, Saskia. So
No.
I wonder if you can make sense of all of that sort of muddle of the things that we've sort of grazed, but not quite.
Yeah. No, I mean, obviously, I'm the same as you're speaking. There's so many things I'm thinking about and want to say. I mean, thinking, actually, that last question you asked about recruitment and kind of how homogenous sort of should that process be and what we're looking for. I think a really important idea is about having a kind of agreement on our school culture, if that makes sense. So what are our values? how does everything that we do, how does our behavior policy, our way of looking at achievement, risk taking, all of these things, how do we make sure they come back to our kind of core values? And, I actually think it's really important for children to experience a variety of different teaching styles and adults and individuals. And for securely attached children, they will be able to tolerate that really well. And like you said, even for insecurely attached children, they will align themselves with some, maybe more than others. But I think we can never make it completely homogenous, and in many ways that's the great thing. But I do think it's about really being consistent when it comes to our kind of core values and practices. What do we want our children to learn? How do we feel about sanctions,
Well,
consequences, restorative
exactly.
conversations,
Yeah, no,
basic.
exactly. And that I was just going to say, sorry, and that's something schools often talk about is we need to get consistency. We need to get consistency. And in doing so, they make certain things consistent that you would imagine for children with insecure attachment would actually make the environment feel less chaotic, more safe, greater clarity, etc., etc., etc. But in doing so, you probably rule out recruiting certain types of individuals who perhaps exist more on the peripheries, the artistic types, the more kind of divergent types themselves. It strikes me that it's a sort of lose-lose situation because your values could become so loose
Yeah.
as to be almost meaningless. Do you see what I mean? Is that
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I actually think that a huge part of resilience in school is being able to engage with and learn from different teachers, or equally have teachers that you don't particularly align yourself with, and then others that kind of really have a good fit. I think that's a really important part of children's kind of resilience of going through school, that life isn't uniform and always consistent. I think it's more about how our values can be consistent, because I think, again, I'm not a teacher, but the way in which you teach might be wildly different, but you may practice the same values in the classroom, which is that we listen to each other, we respect each other's answers, we don't raise our voice as much, or at least as much as we possibly can.
yes?
So I think we can have real variety in educators while still having a really consistent kind of culture. And that's about getting buy-in from staff, sort of getting people on board with what your values are.
Yeah, definitely, because some staff have huge tolerance of noise in the classroom, and that's kind of the environment that they're from themselves and they enjoy. And others want, almost a library, type of environment. So
Yeah.
it's interesting here listening to you thinking about this from the leadership point of view. And you said there, obviously, you're not a teacher, but it's clear that you are an educator, and that's it's a tough sort of balance to strike between giving these students the help that they need, because of course chaotic environments, particularly in creative arts types fields, they are more common. But equally, if your method of discussing things with people is just to shout over them, you would worry that as a school you were setting people up for things like, well, divorce and insecure
Yeah.
relationships and essentially chaotic family lives, which is no good for anybody. Well, obviously divorce in some situations, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. Yeah.
Undesirable, dysfunctional relationships, I suppose, is what I'm trying
No,
to describe.
I mean, absolutely. And also, I always think of sort of it can replicate maybe some of those negative early experiences. So in one moment, the caregiver is really responsive and really loving and warm. And then in the next moment, they're rejecting or angry, and, you're kind of fearful. So I think there is something really important about consistency. But I think when it comes to different, I guess, personalities of teachers and different ways of teaching, I think variety is so important. And, we're thinking a lot right now about insecurely attached children and what they need, but there's also a majority, as we know, of securely attached children, and actually what they will need will be different. So they will need they will need variety because they've got the tools and the ability to build relationships. So they have more room for exploration, for being challenged, for taking risks, for facing emotionally challenging situations. So in a way, we're not doing them justice if we cater only to insecurely attached children. So I think, like you say, it's a lose-lose situation, but equally maybe it's a win-win situation, because for every student, there will be things that really work for them in school and staff that they really fit with and build brilliant relationships with. And, and that's, I guess, the hope.
That's probably the
I think
best argument I've ever heard against schools being consistent, in the sense of everyone must be exactly the same and everything must be exactly the same. That's not a replication of the real world, and it's not useful for children who have a variety of different backgrounds. Sorry, Morgan, go on.
Oh no, I was just thinking there's so much there in the sense that we talk a lot about school culture. One of our other shows, we really focused on the idea of belonging, especially in international schools. And that means that there is a lot of values and there's a lot of consistency in how those values are approached throughout a school. But I think Saskia's point about exploration, that means a lot. That no matter what, we have to have the psychological safety for all students to be able to kind of explore. And we need to make sure that secure students have the ability to to go outside of their comfort zone and explore, and that those insecure students are given the tools and emotional scaffolds, I guess, to do so. I think what we'll do is we'll take a little break now to listen to the news, and then we can dig right back in, because there is still a lot of questions that we have to ask.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
Schools Week reports that the government has abandoned a plan to abolish a rule capping the proportion of pupils oversubscribed free schools can select on faith at 50%. The previous Conservative government consulted last year and also included a plan to remove the block on new faith special schools. However, in an update from the Department for Education, the government has said it will not be moving forward with these proposals at this time. The statement also says they received 3,668 consultation responses, and that 66% of respondents disagreed or strongly disagreed with both proposals. The cap had particularly hindered plans to open Catholic free schools because canon law prevents them from turning away pupils on the basis of their Catholic faith. The government's bill, if passed, would remove the presumptions that new schools must be academies. The Department for Education said this meant faith groups will be able to put forward proposals in response to an invitation from the local authority. The director of the Catholic Education Service welcomed the changes to the bill. The BBC covered the latest research findings around pupils and mobile phones, leading with this headline on its news website: "Mobile ban in schools not improving grades or behaviour, study suggests." The first study in the world to look at school phone rules alongside measures of pupil health and education was undertaken by the University of Birmingham, was peer-reviewed, and its findings published in The Lancet. It compared 1,227 students and their 30 different schools' rules about smartphone use. The paper says schools restricting smartphone use did not seem to be seeing their intended improvements on health, well-being, and focus in lessons. However, the research did find a link between more time on phones and social media and worse mental well-being and mental health, less physical activity, poorer sleep, lower grades, and more disruptive classroom behaviour. Full details of the report and the study and the responses from a range of schools, pupils and the Department for Education can be found on the BBC News website. The BBC in Scotland also reports on education news as it covers a story about data from a controversial survey which asked school pupils about their sexual experiences had been advertised for use by external researchers without participants' explicit consent. The Scottish Government Health and Wellbeing Census hit headlines in 2021 after asking highly personal questions of children as young as 14. Parents said they were not told the nature of the questions and were not asked to agree that their child's information could be shared. In the end, one half of Scotland's 32 councils pulled out of the survey, but 16 councils did go ahead. The survey was completed online, and the survey form said that information would not be shared with your teacher or your family. However, the data is now being offered publicly to external researchers via a website for a charity created by the Scottish Government in 2021, with a stated aim of making it easier to access data around health and well-being. According to the BBC report, the Information Commissioner's Office warned the Scottish Government in 2023 that the way they had gathered, stored and transferred the data created potential risks that children could be identified by third parties. A Scottish Government spokesperson said, all participants in the survey had the opportunity to skip questions they did not wish to answer. Parents have said that when they found out their children had taken part in the survey and understood the questions they'd been asked, including about penetrative sex and contraception use, they'd asked for their child's data to be scrubbed. They were told that this would not be possible. Additional detail and response from academics, schools and parents can be found on the BBC Scotland website. In Northern Ireland, media outlets have reported on criticism for Queen's University Belfast after its decision to open a campus in India was announced. This announcement comes after it said there would be 270 job cuts in Northern Ireland. The University and College Union, which represents many lecturers and support staff, described the move as scandalous. At the time the job cuts were announced, BBC News Northern Ireland said it had seen documents which suggested Queen's was facing a deficit of more than £11 million. UCU General Secretary Joe Grady said, "It is scandalous that QUB is putting massive amounts of money into a new campus halfway around the world, all the while axing jobs in Belfast." Speaking on Good Morning Ulster, another UCU representative said the university had not provided a justified business case. QUB defended its decision to open the campus in India, saying, "We need to balance our income." Finally, Schools Week reports that Education Mutual, who provide insurance cover for thousands of schools, will now cover legal costs for staff who want to sue social media trolls. It comes after Bridget Phillipson said she was concerned about the rise in parental complaints and staff time they take up. Education Mutual will start to cover all its member schools' legal fees should they want to challenge a troll for libelling staff online, including sending cease and desist letters to people who post libel. Some unions already offer this type of support, but not all. Further details can be found on the Schools Week website. This has been Teachers Talk Radio News with Jo Fox.
Welcome back. This is the Friday Lunch Show with Morgan and Todd, and we're here with Saskia Dodd-Smith, and we're looking at attachment theory. So for our next little section, I wanted to focus on kind of school-wide frameworks when we look at social emotional learning. So how can social emotional learning be informed by attachment, and how can we address it through social emotional learning programs? What do you think, Saskia?
So I think there's so much about social emotional kind of learning programs that already overlaps with attachment, and in many ways, I think it's sort of it seeks to, I guess, respond to some of the lack of that may have gone on for young people outside of their school environment. So, for example, we've spoken a lot about emotional regulation. If you are insecurely attached, your understanding of your own emotions is often quite limited or a bit chaotic. Someone hasn't consistently fed that back to you. So then your capacity to regulate your emotions is sort of impaired. And by working to support students to understand their emotions better, to mentalize with others, to imagine how somebody else might feel, to become just more aware of themselves and how they operate is a huge part of I guess, enabling them to go into their lives and function in a way that's going to make them happy and build relationships and allow them, to learn. So I think that it's a huge thing. One of the things I would say is that something that's important to think about when it comes to attachment is that it's not learnt through speaking. I know that sounds like a strange thing to say, but if we think of very early attachment, it's counterintuitive for a counsellor to say, but if you think of very early attachment, it's really about being in tune with the infant. So you don't say to your infant, I think maybe you're feeling like this today, and I wonder if you might be, you mirror it back, you play it out, you respond, you're in tune, you kind of nurture. And there's something about remembering that even though we can equip children with more of an understanding through these programs, so much of what takes place, the real learn is sort of experiential. So they need to practice these things. They need to practice risk taking. And that might be as simple as standing up and doing a talk in front of their class. That might be really difficult for them. They need to face that. They need to be supported. They need to be in an environment where that's encouraged and made to feel as safe as possible. And then even if it is really difficult, it's recognized that it was difficult. They kind of begin to become more aware of themselves, how they feel, and sort of more resilient. But, ultimately a huge part of those programs is about relationships. It's about behavior. How do I make somebody feel? How do they make me feel when I do this? What happens when I do that? How do I feel? So I think that it overlaps in so many ways with attachment, but I think it's just remembering that in a strange way, it's not just about the content of the programs, it's about how they're facilitated. So I think it's, again, the ways in which, the facilitator kind of manages those emotional conversations. They're in tune with their students. They're picking up on different dynamics and emotions going on in the room. That's in many ways more valuable than just the content.
It's really funny. We were talking about, I was having a meeting today where we were looking at well-being. And one of the things that we were discussing is the kind of pedagogical approach that we take to well-being lessons. So not really lessons, but the idea that those times are really times for deep discussion. And some of that discussion builds relationships. It builds collaboration skills, those really in-tune skills of like empathy and understanding, of listening without just waiting for your turn to speak. And those are all kind of opportunities for students to practice. So there's a pedagogical approach to letting students kind of, again, experience those scenarios and practice putting those social emotional muscles into play. Does that make sense?
I mean, it makes complete sense. And it's funny because as a counsellor, one of the things that we think a lot about is, I guess, kind of maybe behavior versus narrative. So, for example, I can sit with a student who might say, let me think about sort of a good example, but who might be talking all about how unfairly they're treated and how their friends don't get them and they don't support them and they never listen. But I notice that in the conversation I'm having with them, they don't allow me to speak. So I notice in the behavior, they might be saying they're a great friend and they're sort of being wronged, but actually what I'm picking up on is the fact that they're struggling to relate to me. And actually the words are maybe less important. What tells me something is how they're behaving with me in the room, and I think it comes back to this idea that we actually don't learn from being told things. We learn from experiencing them. So someone saying, "Oh, you can trust me," is great, but we don't trust someone because they've told us we can trust them. We trust someone because they show us we can trust them. So, for example, in the classroom, if you are encouraging somebody to speak up and to answer a question who might be really kind of anxious and uncomfortable with that, to demonstrate that they can do it and it can be comfortable, or even if it feels uncomfortable, they can get through it. That's much more valuable than giving them a whole speech about why they're able to do it. I don't know if that makes sense, but we learn through experience.
There's so much there. I think, emotional regulation is really key. And I think we see that with teenagers, especially, like as someone who's always taught in secondary schools, emotional regulation is so, so important. And I think one of the things with attachment theory that you mentioned earlier, which is another thread I'd just kind of like to tug on again, is the idea of peer relationships. and how those peer relationships, which are so important for these students, how attachment can be affected and affect what's happening in these adolescents. So how do you kind of not monitor, or how do you facilitate and create those really strong peer relationships that are healthy and have healthy attachment styles?
Yeah, I think that there's, thinking about, for example, well-being lessons. I know we've done well-being lessons on relationships and understanding different behaviors and how they make people feel. I think, again, it's so much about awareness of yourself as a teenager and kind of how you feel, and then being able to empathize and mentalize with others. What we notice is that it's it's a very adolescent kind of developmental challenge to be able to mentalize with others. And I find it fascinating that, I'll work with maybe somebody who is about 12, 13, and, their parents are these terrible people and they're just out to get them and they're so mean to them. And then as they get older and they begin the capacity to develop the capacity to say, oh, well, actually, my mum had a difficult time when she grew up, and sometimes when she shouts at me, I think it's because her mum used to shout at her. And it's amazing how you see them begin to develop the capacity to kind of mentalize, empathize, and imagine sort of what's going on for someone else. But what's so clear is that you need to be able to, I guess, understand yourself and your own emotions before you can extend it out to others. So for some children who don't understand themselves, we need to really focus on, I guess, being in tune with how they're feeling, recognizing when they've done something. And I think this is where in the classroom or corridor conversations are so important. They're really small conversations. And I think one of the things that I often say to teachers that can be a useful strategy is making sure your feedback is really specific. So rather than saying to a student, you were really good today or well done today, saying something like, when you answered that question earlier, I could see that was really difficult. So I'm really proud of you for doing that. There's something really specific about it, because you're helping to kind of color in their internal world and make it more familiar to them and understand what they're doing right, what they're doing maybe wrong, or what their different feelings are. And so being really specific, I guess it's making them feel seen as well, but you're in tune with something going on there. I think I've gone off on a million tangents. There's so many
No,
things.
I love the coloring in their inner world. That really that paints a picture.
Literally.
No, and it's really good as well, Saskia. What you've said there as an English teacher suggests to me the importance of thinking carefully about these types of things when designing curriculum. When we design Key Stage 3 texts, when we think about which text to teach, it does sort of remind me of the importance of picking texts that actually speak to the students' experiences at that point in teenage development, because it is obviously through understanding oneself first and foremost that a lot of this understanding grows to understanding the world and your place within it. And also then, perhaps even having, like you said there, and that's very mature, to have empathy towards your parents. I don't want to say inappropriate response, because, shouting's probably not what we'd all want to do. But we are human and we are fallible, and there are elements of the way in which we interact with each other, which, I don't want to be critical. That's the point I'm getting to here. But it's an influence there on curriculum design as well as in many subject areas.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's really interesting because I frequently have students talking to me about books that they've read, and whether it's in school or outside of school, and saying, oh, I could really relate to this character. And in a way, it's a bit like that mirroring process. They're understanding something about themselves because maybe their experiences of being written in words that, they can make sense of it, they can understand it, and they relate to it. So absolutely. And it also makes me think about this idea of as a teacher, you kind of model you sometimes model these processes of wondering and thinking and being curious. And, oh, actually, when I'm reading this, it's just making me think this. You're sort of narrating your inner world to get them to maybe understand what's going on for them. One of the things I think, I don't know why, but this has just come into my mind, but I do lots of observations in kind of our early year campus, so much, much younger students. And I'll sometimes sit in the room when the teacher's reading to them. And I find it really interesting because for a lot of students, they sit and they look at the book and they look at the pictures. but there are always a few students that are absolutely captivated by the face of the teacher and their expressions, and they are just staring at the teacher. And it's
Yeah.
because the teacher is sort of acting out these emotions, and they're doing these voices, and they're sad when the character's sad. And that those might be the children who haven't had that consistent attachment. So they're still in the stage where they're making sense of those different emotions, and they're internalizing them, and they're wondering. And I always find it very interesting that there are those that are kind of fixated on the teacher rather than maybe the book. They're not quite there yet. And I think that's why sort of modeling things, playing out our emotions, narrating what we're thinking, sometimes in a more dramatic way than would be natural, is really helpful for some students to make sense of themselves.
Absolutely. And even going back to, every year, for a long, long time, I think probably almost every year of my teaching career, I've taught the Book of Mice and Men, either in Key Stage 3 or Key Stage 4, or when I taught in the American curriculum, even it came up. And I genuinely will spend time talking to students about how it made me cry so many times when I first read it. And I'm talking about the third and the fourth and the fifth time. And just to give you context, Saskia, I sort of look like someone shaved a gorilla. So it's probably an emotional depth that they weren't expecting necessarily from a sort of bold northern man. But I find it really important to sort of share with students, well, actually, this is about the fragility of dreams. And of course, none of us are very good at predicting the future, but there's a beautiful uncertainty to life. And sometimes that's scary and that makes us feel vulnerable. And I think as English teachers in particular, this is very important, because we are literally dealing with the fragility of the human heart at times, and modelling that to students as an acceptable process to go through and to consider, and allowing ourselves to be vulnerable. Particularly, I suppose, if you do look like I do, it's probably quite useful for students as well, because they're probably not expecting it, and they probably feel those feelings quite strange the first time they have them. I think that's what you're speaking to there.
Yeah, I absolutely am. And I think it's again this idea that you're not telling them sort of how they should feel, or you're not sort of intellectualizing it. You're playing it out, so you're modeling it. So again, it's experiential, and I think children really absorb those things, and they really remember those things, and it has a massive impact on kind of, I guess, not just the relationship, the sense of trust, I think, is really important too. I think trust is built through feeling that you're safe with someone, and sort of when somebody is in control of their own emotions and talks in that way, I think it makes students feel comfortable, not just with that person, but also with their own feelings in a way. So no, I absolutely agree.
Yeah,
And I think it's
that-
very interesting, just really quickly, I often work with English teachers who students choose to maybe in their writing disclose things that might have happened to them, or, write a poem that you can tell is maybe heavily influenced by their own experience or their own emotions that might be quite concerning. And often it is English teachers that receive those pieces of writing and sort of that have that trust. And I don't think it's because, I mean, obviously it sounds like you're an English teacher. I'm not saying that they're not, that they're superior, but I think it's just something about the nature of the work that they do, the type of kind of emotional learning that goes on.
It's okay, Saskia. You can say we're superior. It's absolutely fine.
I didn't say that.
We meant it though. But there's absolutely something about English teachers and CPOMs and safeguarding, or whatever platform people choose to use. We do seem to get these incidental disclosures because you're dealing with emotion and emotional depth. And I think within the framework of new GCSEs and even the international GCSEs, there cannot be times the forgetting that the heart is at the very core of my subject, but many subjects as well. Morgan and I have spoken about this in depth about geography. And I think actually those opportunities must not be ignored, because exam results are absolutely superb. But, let's imagine now a child that has deeply insecure attachment and comes across as incredibly neurotic and emotional and difficult to be around, even perhaps in the workplace. Nobody cares that they got all nines in GCSE and A stars. They care that they're quite hard to be around. So actually, achievement in education is not just about GCSE outcomes, and I think that's or A level outcomes for that matter. And I think that's a really important point to have touched upon.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, it made me think of something that sort of came to mind earlier, which is that this idea of being difficult to be around. I think one of the things that's very hard is that securely attached children tend to kind of elicit warm and kind of kind responses from staff because there's something comfortable and easy about them. Whereas for insecurely attached children, sometimes they kind of evoke the opposite response. And it's almost like a double trauma because they've been through this difficult thing that's made them unable to develop kind of those behaviors. And then on top of that, something about how they operate kind of make it repeatedly difficult for people to be in their space. And actually, I think becoming aware of attachment as educators is about being able to hold that empathy for the students that you find, maybe difficult to be around or that you can't
Yeah.
quite relate to, and simply kind of educating staff on that, helping them to understand it. I often say to teachers, I'm not giving them strategies that will be alien to them. These are all things that they'll probably already do all the time, but it's maybe giving them the why behind some of them. So I think if we can recognize that about students and what they evoke in us, we can hopefully hold on to that empathy that's necessary to create the right environment for them.
Yeah, and I'm
I
not a
think that's
psychologist, and I wouldn't want to pretend to be one. But am I right in saying as well that each loss for the human mind causes a reduction in serotonin, and therefore, makes the next loss more likely? And so, if teachers are going to be part of breaking that cycle, they need to recognise some of these things to be a supportive guide, for those students that have tried to attach to a parent or a loved one or whoever, and it's failed, and then they go to school, and because they have that insecure attachment, it fails again, and
Yeah.
we need to be part of breaking that cycle. I know I'm sort of playing pop psychologist here, but there is a lot of importance actually on that for students who are in that cycle, I would say.
No, absolutely. And I think that really school is such a unique environment because it's one of the only periods in our life where we'll go into this place where we have this structure that's clear. We know kind of what hour to hour is going to look like. We know who are going to be the key participants in that. And these adults are there essentially to nurture and care for us. I mean, for however many years you're in school, that's such an incredible opportunity to make use of that for those students. And it may be very, very difficult, and you may only be able to, help 5%, but that's a huge, huge amount for them.
I think it's what's really, really clear is that it's the awareness that matters. I think you're right. When we are given the lenses to kind of say, oh, why, and have that deeper understanding, I think it allows us to be gentler and more nuanced, more understanding in our approaches to students when we think, oh, maybe they're alienating us when it's us kind of not giving them what they need. So I have so many notes written down. What I'm going to do is we're going to have a short word from our sponsors, and then I think we're just going to have some concluding thoughts because there is so much to unpack before we sign off today.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading.
Meet USA Study, your one-stop platform for guiding students through their college application journey. Access up-to-date resources on universities, programs, scholarships, and application requirements, all in one place. Get easy-to-access tools, personalized timelines, expert tips, application templates, and exclusive webinars with admissions officers to help your student stand out. Visit usastudy.co.uk or call Phil at 0800 612 8271 because every student deserves the opportunity to shine with USA Study.
So just to kind of bring this all to a close, Saskia, I can't even tell you, I have taken 6 pages of notes. So I have a red pen with me, and I just, in my notebook, whenever guests come on, I take notes and notes and notes, and I have just covered my book with questions and further thoughts and ideas. And I just kind of picked out a few things that we kind of mentioned along the way. So I was thinking about the importance of learning environment and whether that's consistency, value-driven, the idea of having that psychologically safe space being so important when we take attachment into account. I was thinking about role modeling that we do as teachers and just how important that is. And role modeling that emotional regulation, role modeling that kind of the interactions that we have with our students by doing things like giving that specific feedback. I was thinking about the idea of curriculum as a tool. So curriculum is a tool in the way that Todd said, that we use specific texts to connect with students and giving them the opportunity pedagogically to practice a lot of those skills that they would need in order to build relationships that are really healthy. So there's a lot there that I've just kind of like written down. I wanted to ask you, Saskia, just before we kind of leave off, what is the advice that you would give to teachers that they could use tomorrow that would help improve their practice in relation to attachment theory?
I think it's a difficult question. I mean, what I really always come back to is this idea of a kind of good enough parent. And I think sometimes when we learn about something new and when we shine a light on our practice, we can actually become a bit overwhelmed with possibly the things that we're not doing or what we should be doing. But actually, I think it's about little and often. It's about those brief conversations. It's about really engaging. I know it sounds like a sort of obvious thing to say, but eye contact, using children's names, being genuinely interested in what they're saying, or at least, or at least demonstrating that to them. So I think these are the ways that students feel thought about, heard. If we are interested in children, they are interested in themselves. And I think that's, it comes back to self-esteem, all of these things. But the most important thing, I think, really is thinking to yourself, what am I seeing in this student? What does this maybe tell me about what's gone on for them? And therefore, maybe what is it that's been missing? What do I possibly need to do? Because I do think it's about sort of equity over equality. We need to think about these individual students and what they might need. But it doesn't mean we have to get it right all the time. We just have to be engaged and I guess on board with it. And that's the most important thing.
I love how you say if we are interested in students, they are interested in themselves. I think by us seeing them and them feeling seen, there's something so powerful there. Todd, what are your concluding thoughts?
I suppose my takeaway is about authenticity. It's about being who we genuinely are within a framework. Obviously, you spoke about schools needing to have consistency and values, but actually, I'm thinking about sometimes this is an area of my own practice that I really worry about, and I think, oh gosh, I am quite authentic, and yet students who come from quite challenging backgrounds will often sort of attach themselves to me and want to kind of interact and make sense of their own lives with me. And perhaps that's the nature of my subject a little bit, but also I'd like to hope that it's because I'm showing up quite authentically to my room, and I'm quite light as well. So actually, it's making me reflect on something that I'd previously seen as a weakness, which is my authenticity, and think actually no, that's something to safeguard and to keep to treasure actually. But within that framework, I don't know if that tallies with what you've been trying to say, Saskia, or if I've totally misheard.
No, not at all. It really does. And I think it's there's something about I always, when I speak with parents, I always talk about the idea that you're making attempts to understand, even by them being sat there in the room with me, being curious, wanting to learn. That's such a powerful thing for a young person to see their parent do. And I think that when we're curious, when we're authentic, when we are genuinely kind of ourselves and interested in bringing who we are, I think that makes people feel safe. I think it makes children feel able to replicate that and do that themselves. So no, it makes complete sense. And also we have to be ourselves, because when we're not ourselves, there's something interfering with our capacity to build a relationship immediately. So actually, within reason,
Yes,
we absolutely
yes.
have to be ourselves.
Yeah, within the framework almost. But yeah, you're right. Within reason might be a better way of framing it. And I almost think of that. When what's the sort of Christmas game where you touch your nose and you point at the person when they've got the thing. I feel like kids do that when you're not being authentic. It's like, haha, I spotted it. That was a lie. That wasn't you. You were pretending to be a person that you're not. So
they
have a really
won't
good
trust you.
They have a really good
intuitive.
radar for it. They're really attuned to you being fake. Morgan, what about you?
So intuitive.
Yeah, absolutely. Morgan, what about you? What's your big takeaways?
My big takeaway is the entire time that we've been talking, I've been thinking about students that I've taught in the past, and all of a sudden I'm thinking that's why they did this, or that's why they paid more attention, or that's why they responded to me in this way, or I also think about those misses, like that's why I missed this student, why I couldn't connect with them. There's a lot in there where I'm like, I need to look out for this in the future. Honestly, it's given me a lot of understanding. And it makes me very aware of how I need to be so careful and judicious with how I interact with students, because each interaction might have more weight than I realize. And I think it's really hard when you have busy days and you literally have thousands of interactions with students in
Yeah.
a day. But those small moments that Saskia was talking about, those small moments add up to mean a lot. So they're more important than we realize. And I think about how I should just be more aware of that as I go through my day. So yeah, I found it extremely illuminating.
And
Saskia,
I
I
think
can't thank you enough for coming on, because I've gained a lot from this.
No, I mean, genuinely, thank you for having me, because I could talk about it forever. I find it a fascinating topic, and I love when it sparks an interest in other people. So no, I'm really grateful. Thank you.
No, it's really good, Saskia, and I actually think we could even do this again, but drill down on one particular area. But I just want to pick up on what Morgan said there, and if I was sort of advising other teachers on this area based on our conversation, that single word you said, enough, you are enough and attached enough. I think that's actually really important as well, because the fact we're engaged in this conversation shows that we are trying our absolute best to be enough for those students, and it isn't always easy. So Morgan, I thought that was a really honest and good reflection, but equally, the fact you're even thinking like that shows a real level of a seriousness to students and their future on an individual level as well as an academic level.
Well, I think this has given us so much to think about. Saskia, we would love to have you on again. I have several other topics that I want you to kind of discuss. So you will be receiving another invitation soon. But thank you so much for giving up your time tonight. And I hope that everyone has enjoyed the show. Thank you so much, and have a lovely Friday and happy Valentine's.
Thank you, everyone. Have a lovely evening.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.